Tom Alleman has been a teacher here at the Los Angeles Center of Photography for many years. He teaches courses on the photographer's eye, both part 1 and part 2. And I should mention, Tom is scheduled to teach photographer's eye part 2 actually this Thursday, starting this Thursday. It's an online class. I'll have Jason post the link to that in the chat. And Tom also teaches photographing the social landscape. And there's recently, he started to teach a class on street photography. I should also mention that Tom was the winner of our Street Photography Around the World exhibition, 6th annual Street Photography Around the World exhibition. This is back in 2020, right before our building shut down before the pandemic. So I remember that fondly, Tom. It was the last event we actually had at that center, major event before we went into COVID. So, but
that's the last time I've heard that.
It was fun, good memories. We'll get that going again soon. But I do want to read off, Tom's got extensive credits to his name and would not do justice without reading those. I would like to just quickly present him officially. He was born and raised in Detroit, where his father was a traveling salesman. His mother was a ceramic artist. He graduated from Michigan State University with a degree in English literature. During a 15-year newspaper career, Tom was a frequent winner of distinctions from the National Press Photographers Association, as well as being named California Newspaper Photographer of the Year in 1995 and Los Angeles Newspaper Photographer of the Year 1996. As a magazine freelancer, Tom's pictures have been published regularly in Time, People, Business Week, Barron's, Smithsonian, and National Geographic Traveler. Tom's series of street photographs, social studies, was exhibited widely in Southern California. Sunshine and Noir, his book-length collection of black and white urban landscapes made with Holgas in the neighborhoods of Los Angeles, won first prize in the travel category of the prestigious Photography Book Now competition. Sunshine and Noir had its solo debut at the After Image Gallery in Dallas in April of 2006 and was exhibited at the Robin Rice Gallery, New York in 2008 and 2013, and also at the Blue Sky Gallery in Portland in 2009 and 2015, among other galleries and museums. The series American Peril debuted at the Red Line Art Center in Denver, and Dancing in the Dragon's Jaws, Tom's reportage from gay San Francisco in the mid-1980s, debuted at the Juliet Gallery in San Francisco in 2022. An extensive list of credits. This terrifically talented photographer and lecturer. Gives me a great honor to introduce our guest tonight, Mr. Alleman. Take it away, sir.
Thank you, Brandon. I appreciate that. Boy, wow, that's a lot. That's a lot to have read. Good job. Thank you for making it through that. Although, might I say, the Jewett Gallery show of Dancing in the Dragon's Jaws was 2012, not 2022.
Did I say 2022?
Well, I think yes. Yes, you did. As a matter of fact, I was just testing you. I can re-roll the tape if you'd like. Yeah,
I was testing you, and you're awake, so that's good to know.
Well, but you know what? That it almost killed me. Mounting that show almost killed me, and so I won't. I don't easily remember. I don't easily forget that that was 10 years ago. Thank God. Every day we get further from the nightmare that was me doing that. So,
you're still looking good, my friend.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Rode hard and hung up wet. Welcome, folks. Thank you all for being here. So I'm going to do the history, a very selected history of street photography. And when I say selected, there are stark parameters to this presentation. So this will be approximately 1900 to 2000. And it'll be mostly Western photographers. I have a whole list and catalog of photos and slides and anecdotes about non-Western street photographers. But when we open this presentation to those options, it's like the floodgates, and it's just too much material. I'm barely gonna get to the usual suspects. I'll try to interject a few unusual suspects, but for those of you who aren't familiar with the story arc of street photography in the Western world in the last 100 years, we need to nail the biggies. But I think, but speaking of biggies, and that implies the big stars and heroes of the show, of course we'll show their pictures, but I think I want to angle in on the material by kind of lumping folks into technical and historic genres as we go along. I think that's a way to kind of open up the conversation. So we'll begin with a discussion of the type of person who in the past became the street photographer. We'll talk about the cameras that made street photography possible. And at a certain point, we'll make passing reference to developments in film that made street photography possible. Also color products and strobes. And in the middle, we'll speak about kind of the stars of the game. And if I can, I'll try to shed a little light on kind of the historic circumstances that made those people possible. As we move toward the end of the century I'm about to talk about, street photography changes because street photographers change. Street photographers using the technology of the day, which is digital cameras and or strobes, begin to come inside. They move inside starting in the mid-70s. And once they do that, then the nature of the craft begins to change. And I shouldn't say that, not the nature of the craft, the nature of the art, the nature of the story. In other words, what they photograph, what they can photograph, and how they begin to treat that material changes. There are, and you might know, if you don't, this is a super true fact about the culture of street photography. There are many very passionate, almost militant practitioners of street photography. Somehow they usually tend to be white men in their mid-50s who insist that street photography is an act, a behavior, a theater, a piece of theater that occurs outdoors. It happens on the streets of large cities, and it is nothing more or less than that. However, as we'll see, street photographers like Gary Winogrand, surely one of the 3 or 4 great photographers of the 20th century, began moving indoors in the 70s. Others followed. Cartier-Bresson had already been indoors. And once you go indoors, now you're photographing dancers, dancing, conventions, political conventions, in a variety of venues, and people doing things they wouldn't do necessarily on the streets. So the street photography impulse, the street photography urge, heads inside and starts and gets deployed on a different group of people who are behaving by different rules. There's a kind of an intimacy, even in a public place like a bar. A bar is a public place, but it's different than a street. A baseball stadium is a public place, but it's different than a street. And yet, Gary Winogrand, William Klein, Todd Papageorge, Eli Reed, they're all there in those venues behaving on their instincts. So if there is an urge towards street photography, the practitioners who do that work will do it anywhere. And in the last 30, 40 years, they do it anywhere. And so the nature of the beast it has evolved. In the beginning, it was something done on the street. But I don't believe that we should allow the kind of the purists to insist that that's only where this happens. Okay, so we're going to begin in 1900 on the street, and we're going to slowly move indoors as technology allows. Okay, off we go. We'll begin with a character type, the flaneur. The flaneur is a word coined, who knows by whom. Perhaps it's Charles Baudelaire, but there are others who were talking about this emergent character type in the 1880s, 90s, and at the turn of the century. As the 20th century turned, the Western world was becoming decidedly modern and self-consciously modern. In other words, we knew we were modern. The word itself, in all its locutions, was uttered constantly by poets, academics, newspaper writers, and everyday folks. They talked about modern art, modern life, the modern world, in the same way, that same sense of awe and wariness that we these days say our digital era, this digital era, these digital times that we live in. Digital changes everything, and it's constantly on our minds, this rapid rate of change wrought by digital culture. Well, same was true at the turn of the 20th century, vis-a-vis the notion of modernity. Much of the modernity that so fascinated people was outside their houses, not inside. The insides of people's houses didn't begin to change too much until the 20s and 30s. The city and the street bustled with automobiles, soaring steel-framed architecture, a brand new thing that allowed buildings to get real tall, real fast. Also department stores, new civic wonders. World capital was on the climb, thanks in no small part to colonialism abroad, and that money was invested in infrastructure and all sorts of that groovy, spangly, brand new stuff that makes the turn of the 20th century such a remarkable time. The street, therefore, became a stage. Marches and demonstrations happened there, goods were peddled there, immigrants wandered there, status was paraded. Out of these conditions, and that's always how it is, isn't it? People, heroes, archetypes don't generate themselves randomly. They arise out of conditions. A predictable character type comes onto the scene. I say predictable because if you study the conditions, it's clear that this guy is gonna happen. He is today perhaps a hipster, a knowing hipster. He's a connoisseur of sea life and street theater known as the flaneur. Again, this is a type that is still with us. The poet Charles Baudelaire recognized the flaneur as a passionate observer, quote unquote, who is, he wrote, at the center of the world and yet remains hidden from the world. Flaneurs were often, of course, white men of means. They alone could travel boulevards and parks safely and anonymously. Indeed, the earliest of the known street photographers were men of independent wealth. And we'll come to Eugene J., a great example of that, sometime soon. Yes. So when Eugene J., who we'll come to soon, was 20, Napoleon III, the Emperor of France, commenced an urban renewal plan that was draconian and spectacular for its time. It was his notion to remap and revise all of Paris, especially its boulevards and plazas. For 30 years, the construction of those new boulevards, parks, plazas, landmarks occupied the capital city. Eugene J. began photographing the changing city when he was 41 in 1988. Things that construction and dramatic change had been afoot for 20 years by then, but it would continue for the next 30, right? So at J, a professional photographer at the time, decided that he would go out into what was becoming Old Paris and photograph it before it went away. Those of you who are aware of other such nascent documentary photographers will know that that's the documentary urge. That's of the 5 or 6 documentary urges, that's number one. Vanishing cultures, vanishing buildings, vanishing peoples, vanishing tribes. One of the essential documentary urges is to photograph that or record that stuff before it's gone for good. And so that was at J's instinct at that time. At J had built a successful business making photographs of trees, flowers, buildings, and streets that architects and artists used for their studies. And that's where he made his money, and apparently a lot of it. Thus, he was well equipped to document the neighborhoods that would be demolished to make way for the new Paris. At J made those images over about 30 years. Sometimes he worked on his own, and sometimes he worked on commission from the Library of French History in Paris. What sets him apart from other flaneurs who occasionally made photographs is his dedication, his technical mastery, and his native instinct for the depiction of space. At J created much of the essential vocabulary and grammar of photography in public places. Our notions of depth and perspective in the urban environment begin with at J's voluminous catalog of Parisian images. One of my favorites. So at J and others, let me see. Yep, there you go. At J and others worked with heavy view cameras on cumbersome tripods. Here we see photographers using much smaller cameras than at J ever used. And they're on Mulberry Street in Little Italy in New York City at the turn of the century. At J worked with heavy cameras on cumbersome tripods using large sheets of film one at a time, not very easy to scuttle and scoot around and make anything that might resemble what we call street photography. By the 1920s, smaller cameras were available, and Kodak manufactured roll film that accommodated several shots on each long strip. Suddenly, you could shoot 36 pictures, whereas prior to about 1925, you shot one at a time, or in some cameras, you might shoot 8 or 10 on a strip of film. This camera is the camera owned and operated by Henri Cartier-Bresson, who we'll discuss next. So small cameras are where street photography really begins. The photographers who owned and operated them could be more nimble. They could move and groove. They could hold the cameras in their hands. They could switch from horizontal to vertical. They could focus in an instant. They could shoot under a variety of situations and circumstances. If you can get your body and your face somewhere, the Canon will follow, and you can make a photograph from that vantage. So here's young Henri Cartier-Bresson in about 1932 with his brand new Leica. And Leica was the first popular version of the small 35 millimeter style camera that shot 36 pictures on a roll of film. It was introduced in a soft way, let's say, in about 1926, and in a concerted marketing effort in about 1932. Cartier-Bresson purchased one of the early versions. He was a son of wealth. It was easy for him to do that, and also to begin traveling thereafter. Cartier-Bresson had, his family was in the, they were a mercantile family doing garments. They were in the fabric business. And so that afforded him the opportunity to find himself. And once he had found himself, more or less, they were able to fund his travels to Cuba and Mexico, to Spain, and then back to Paris, where he worked for many years making the very first kind of popular street photographs as we know them to be. What we get from Cartier-Bresson is a real precision in the kind of the acquittal of the photograph. It's well focused, it's well exposed, it's supremely well composed. And as with at J, much of what we know about how photographs are supposed to look comes from Cartier-Bresson. He was a natural at it. Also, he was bold in his compositional styles. And perhaps that is because he, in the 20s, before he acquired that camera, he trained as a painter and a filmmaker, and a dude who drank deeply and often in bars and cafes with artists, surrealists, Dadaists. In fact, he said to later interviewers, "I'm a surrealist at heart." So that perhaps accounts for his juxtaposition of unlikely things, his uncanny view of space and how space is used. Cartier-Bresson developed a way of thinking about his photographs, which has, in a way, outlasted most people's knowledge of the actual pictures. What I mean is, many young photographers hear about the decisive moment as much as anything from general photography that has kind of oozed its way into the popular culture. Many of us misunderstand the decisive moment. Our belief seems to be that it is capturing, I'm going to go back a picture, it is capturing something like this, which is a person at the peak of a peak action, as if maybe he was catching a football or hitting a home run. Capturing that peak action is only part of what Cartier-Bresson meant by the decisive moment. Indeed, if only he was speaking about that, that would be good enough. That's interesting enough as a way of thinking about photography. But Cartier-Bresson, as a surrealist and as someone who was extremely intent on composing images in a bold way, his issue was that the decisive moment was a moment, a shard of time in the life and mind of the photographer. The photographer engages in a process of thinking and feeling, an instinctual process while he or she is making the photograph. And he or she looks for the elements in the picture to come together, as this one does so handsomely, to create a balanced frame, a thriving, rich frame full of stuff, right? And the moment at which all those come together is, for the photographer, a decisive moment. And Cartier-Bresson urges the photographer to act in that decisive moment. Click your frame. So it's not just a gestural thing. It's not just a man jumping for a basketball. Of course, you must have the skill set, the technical know-how to nail that, but that only matters within the context of the frame and in the mind of the photographer at that ultimate moment when they click the shutter. Cartier-Bresson was about clicking the shutter at the decisive moment. There he is again in his middle age, sometime after the war. So speaking of which, so sometime after the war, that implies late 40s, that happens to be when Cartier-Bresson and David Chim Seymour and Robert Capa and Werner Bischoff created the photographic agency Magnum, which became a collective which marketed the photographs of its celebrity photographers. I say celebrity photographers, that's unkind. They are almost 2 to 1. Photographers, we all know, they are and were photographers that are considered the best in the world. A very, very elite core of very special artists who all gathered under the rubric of Magnum, which, as I say, marketed their photographs. Cartier-Bresson, Bischoff, Capa, and David Seymour created that agency in New York in 1947 and began gathering those photographers. And so saying, 1947 is when street photography really begins opening up. America and the West become affluent, more so than ever. People can buy cameras, people can travel, the cities fill with people again, and that creates photographers. It creates people who are able to devote their time and their resources to being on the street and making pictures that no one has asked them to make. So the kind of the skyrocketing of the Western economies creates photographers, and it creates the conditions under which photographers can work. Air flight, trains, events, and the advent of the picture magazines. In 1950, half of Americans read picture magazines every week. This is in the era before television, surely before cable and streaming. If you wanted to know what the events of the world looked like, picture magazines were exactly and entirely where you got that information. Magnum was one of the essential agencies that fed those magazines, and therefore basically created visual culture in America and the West in the 1950s. So those of you who are aware of the great Robert Frank will know that this presentation is sneaking up on him. We're heading towards Robert Frank now, aren't we? But I want to interject William Klein before we get to Frank, because Klein is, well, he's surely not a lost figure, but he's a figure who has kind of sunk from sight or from the notice of many young photographers. Klein was a member of the New York School, a loose affiliation of New York photographers who, like Robert Frank and then Deanne Arbus, Bruce Davidson, and many of the other greats, they were gritty New York photographers on the make in the 50s, working in the city, on the streets, and making tough street photographs that kind of led the visual culture. And so Klein is one of my great favorites. He's one of my very early favorites. He's one of the 2 or 3 people that made me want to make my own photographs in a particular way. And so here are some photographs from William Klein. You will see that they don't resemble Cartier-Bresson's. They don't resemble much that was out there at the time. They are ambivalent, angry in a certain way. They are distressed in their tonalities and in their grain. They're off the cuff, they're blurry, they're undisciplined, they're too passionate. These are the photographs of a wise guy, a loudmouth dude from down the block who's basically just racing around with his camera. But they are the missing link between Cartier-Bresson, a very mannered, intellectual Parisian, and Robert Frank. So now we come to Frank. Frank is a Swiss American. He grew up near Zurich and apprenticed there to a photographer before the war. Afterwards, he came to America, and it would be kind of untrue to say he settled in New York City. That was his home base in this hemisphere, but he traveled extensively, making little photo portfolios from his adventures in Peru and in London, Wales, and elsewhere. So he was, you know, a young person kind of on the go. When he got a couple bucks, he'd take a train or a plane somewhere else and stay for 3 months and create the photographs that would go into that little portfolio. And but having gathered these portfolios and showing them around New York City, he began to get a bit of a reputation. He made a few highly placed friends, and one of them, the great Walker Evans, was able to support Frank's submission for a Guggenheim Fellowship, which he did win in 1955. And with that, he took off onto the road for a couple of years, often with his family in tow, and they drove around America. And he made the photographs, which would end up in this book, The Americans, which if you all, if anybody doesn't have that book, it's relatively inexpensive as photo books go. It's about a $35 book. It is the one essential book that you must own. If you're new to all this, start with The Americans. If for no other reason than if you were new to pop or rock music, you know, you would buy a Beatles album and Blonde on Blonde and the second Led Zeppelin, just because you should, right? And so that's it's almost making a pilgrimage to buy that book and to own that book. So these are photographs that Frank made in London and Wales en route to securing a Guggenheim and taking off into America. This happens to be Long Beach, California, not far from where I'm sitting right now. Oops, sorry, Nebraska, somewhere. That's Detroit. That's where I grew up. Hoboken, New Jersey, I believe. When that book of photographs, I believe there were 86 of them, something like 86. When that was published in 1958 by Del Pierre, a French publisher, Jack Kerouac was contracted to write the introduction. Kerouac was, as you know, a newly minted celebrity, a scruffy beat poet who had spent many years scrambling and living hand to mouth, an unpublished writer who, with the publication finally of On the Road, got to be a star. And it was pretty clear that he was the best person to write the introduction to the Americans, and he riffed on this picture, the lonely elevator girl. He swooned for her, and thought of her fondly, whatever that means. But he made a point of she was kind of the fulcrum of his essay. Frank's pictures, unlike other photographs of the day, were not slick, and they were not committed. They weren't emotionally or politically committed to the things that photography was committed in the 50s. As America became more prosperous, powers that be, specifically people in media and publishing, people like Henry Luce and most of the publishers of the picture magazines, they were all on record as saying that we have this incredible economic engine, we have a prosperous populace that's just come out of a very weird 20 years, depression, war, Holocaust, nuclear bombs, and we need to get them on board. The new America awaits us, and we need to form consensus behind religious and political values, a conservative temperament in America as it grows into its status as a world power, and as we all buy homes in the suburbs and have babies. And Frank didn't go along with that. Frank was a smart aleck Frenchman who was skeptical of this American media consensus. And so his photographs didn't demonstrate American values or godly values, which it was hoped photographs would demonstrate in that era. His photographs are ambiguous, they are ambivalent, they are non-committal, they are technically a little screwy. They're not the kind of thing that Life magazine would have loved for its kind of psycho-political reasons, right? And so the photo establishment, which were people like the editors of Life magazine, critics, academics, general viewers, they detested these pictures. They said, what are these pictures? Well, at least five. They don't tell our American story in the way that we believe and expect the American story needs to be told. Frank often photographed Americans who were lonely, isolated, alienated. If you looked at these pictures only, you would think that Americans weren't necessarily on board with the spirit of the times. That was Frank's position. He believed that that was a true fact, despite what Time Incorporated said. And so in the beginning, these pictures were lambasted in the press. It took 10 years for this group of pictures to find an audience, a sympathetic audience. But the children of those prosperous suburbanites, when they grew into their maturity in the 60s and 70s, they saw that Frank was onto something. They got his message. And so that book of photographs gained in popularity, and at this point has become almost kind of a sacred touchstone. By the way, so this is the last of these pictures I'll show. This happens to be the drive-in near my house when I was growing up. That's the Gratiot Drive-In. And we spent many a drunken teenage night right there at that drive-in. So imagine my surprise when I first saw this photograph. There's Frank in his middle age. He stopped, he kind of pretty much stopped making popular photography shortly after the Americans. He might have spent a couple, 3 years enjoying his new celebrity, but then he turned to filmmaking. And after that, he moved, in the 70s, he moved to Nova Scotia and began making more obscure art style photographs with bigger and different cameras. He never published another big book of photographs again. Where are we? We are in about 1960. An important thing happens in 1962. The directorship of the photography department at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City changes hands. Edward Steichen, one of the great photographers of the century, a man of many different skills, had become the director of that department in the late 40s or early 50s. He, I think, was the second director of that department. I think that department is maybe like a certain kind of dictatorship. They only change bosses once every 30 years. It had been Beaumont Newhall, the great historian, and then Steichen. And in 1962, Steichen turned the directorship over to a hand-picked successor, a guy named John Sarkovsky. Why is any of this important? These days, with our internet, we have such a vast number of venues, forums, formats for people to get their work out, to get their photographs out, but even to get their point of view out about photographs, about anything, of course. We have Twitter and all the social medias. We have blogs and YouTube videos. For that reason, anybody can become a known commentator, a known expert, a performing intellectual, right? We have far fewer gatekeepers than we ever did. However, back in the day, 1962, there were a handful of gatekeepers. The world of art and culture was really run by 25 people. The world of photo culture was run, for lack of a better word, by 2 or 3 folks, one of which was the director of the Department of Photography at the Museum of Modern Art. In those days, Edward Steichen and then John Sarkovsky would not only make or break a career, but they would make or break entire historical trends, fields of thought, ideas about what photo culture was. And Sarkovsky was very ambitious about that. He was a great writer. He had a great eye for photography. And his belief was that street photography / social documentary, which he lumped in as the same very compact continuum of behavior. It was all kind of the same to him. Social documentary, street photography, kind of all the same. And his belief was that that strain, that area of photography was the essence of the art. And the world needed to recognize that. So he began mounting shows and writing catalog essays, mounting other shows and writing magazine articles. And in a way, he created the culture of street photography from about 1962 onward. And most of us know that that is the golden age. Well, isn't that funny to say? Those who are passionate about it agree that that was the beginning or the golden part of the era of street photography. So in 1967, Sarkovsky mounted a show called New Documents at the Museum of Modern Art. He included 3 and 3 photographers only, all young folks, about 40, give or take 3 or 4 years on either side of being 40. And these were the people that he believed would lead us forward into photography's next chapter. They were all photographers who worked on the streets. Lee Friedlander, Gary Winogrand, and the well-known and mourned Deanne Arbus. So here are some photographs from Lee Friedlander. Friedlander was trained not far from where I live here at the Art Center, College of Design in Pasadena, California. He was a West Coaster. He had come from Washington State near Seattle and came down, as we say, he came down to Pasadena and studied at that school, which was a very kind of technical academy. Then he went to New York City to begin a commercial career. He spent a little time doing magazine covers, especially in the jazz realm. Some of the classic, I mean, the classic jazz albums by Miles Davis and Charles Mingus and John Coltrane. The portraits were photographed by Friedlander. But then soon he soured, shall we say, on the commercial life and threw himself as completely as possible into doing his documentary work and his street work. He traveled widely and but also worked in New York City every day. He and Winogrand, Todd Papa George, Joel Meyerowitz, they all scrambled up and down Fifth Avenue at lunchtime every single day for years. 63, 4, 5, 6. Those four guys were always out there banging heads and assaulting passersby. Friedlander, as you can see from this picture especially, is a great fan of visual puns. He was clever, coolly aloof. He wasn't as sweaty and hungry as Gary Winogrand, whose work you'll see in a second. He didn't attack his subjects with gusto. He considered them and arranged his frames in a very sophisticated way. His pictures are full of jokes and unlikely juxtapositions. He's very much about chaos, visual chaos, and how he's going to solve it. He's probably the most intellectual of those three New Documents photographers. And he has had a long, long career. He is still alive and up until very recently has been at work. He's, to my eye, the most Catholic of all photographers, Catholic in the sense of having a wide range of interests. He has shot everything for years and has published probably 40 books. His first book, as a matter of fact, was a book of self-portraits called Self-Portrait. So that book gathered probably 10 or 12 years worth of these kinds of photographs made in New York City, in which either his reflection or his shadow, some artifact or aspect of his doppelganger is evident in the picture. One of my all-time favorite of the Friedlander pictures. I first looked at this in college, and to say we have access to 1 trillion pictures. I mean, I think in this presentation alone, we have 130 pictures. We have access to lots of pictures in our digital and electronic culture, and we learn from them all, I suppose. I had access to 12 pictures, 40 pictures, when I was teaching myself photography in 1980. And still in all, it was a very rich learning experience. Perhaps it could be said that one learns as much from 40 well-beloved pictures as one does from 4,000 pictures that you skim through. Swipe left, swipe left. So, another aspect of Friedlander as a punster, making jokey photographs that are also rather elegant. Photographs that are strange and hard to look at, and that was part of the program was to not make the photograph that the event asks you to make. He along with many photographers to come, found that street photography was often about subverting the assigned narrative to an event or to a scene, and finding a way to kind of change the story. Gary Winogrand worked, as did many of the great photographers of the day. They had a day job, and most of them worked for those magazines. And that's where they made their living. In fact, Winogrand, I think, worked for Sports Illustrated, among others. But surely he was not that kind of photographer when he went out on the street, except that he was probably athletic, passionate, and sweaty by the end of the day. His photographs are sweaty. As I think I've said, his photographs are hungry. He looks like a guy who's leaping at his subject matter. Winogrand, but for all of that apparent kind of animal energy that he brought to his work and to the photographs, the lustiness and the vigor and the energy he brings. He's also a very astute observer. This photograph is one of my favorite examples of that. He sees everything, and he is has a very sharp eye for human psychology and intimations of inner life. That's been, of course, one of the great debates that photographers have had with themselves, viewers and critics for 100 years, is, can a photograph tell us, can it demonstrate or reveal the inner life of a subject? And I think it was believed, it was fashionable to believe at one time that, yes, indeed, a photograph could demonstrate the the personality or the spirit or the soul of a person. Winogrand did not believe that, but he wanted to go as far as he could, and for him that was make photographs that demonstrate somebody having an inner life. So all of his people are alive in their minds. His subjects are having an experience. Their faces tell us they are. He doesn't presume to know what that experience is. He doesn't presume to see their souls, but he knows they have one. It's written on their face. So in these pictures, you can see, for example, here, you have the smug man with the sweater vest and the tie. You have the laughing hippie on the floor. You have a variety of other character types, all of whom are having an experience of this moment, just as Winogrand and the viewer are. Again, we don't presume to tell you what the hippie is thinking, but clearly he's thinking something. He's having his inner life is experiencing this moment in a marked way. Finally, the third person in that famous trio of the New Documents presentation at the Museum of Modern Art in 1967 is Diane Arbus. Arbus was the daughter of Russian immigrants who, in the grand American tradition, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and became millionaires. They built Russik's department store in New York City, one of the great department stores of its day. Young Diane married Mr. Arbus, I'm blanking his name, and they became a fashion photography team that that worked for Russik's, fancy that, and other clients. She did that for 10 years with the seamless and and the clothes and the models. But their marriage fell apart in the late 50s, and she decided to become a photographer on the street. And she adapted. It took her 5 years to learn her style, to learn that she didn't want to work with a Leica and its grain. She wanted to work with a bigger camera, larger negatives. And indeed, if she used a strobe, there'd be almost no grain at all. And that's somehow what she was after, was that forensic specificity of the strobe and the big negative. So here she is working in Central Park, which was her beat. It's where she found a lot of her folks. She found other of her subjects by researching them and in a way dreaming about them. She'd say, I wonder what it'd be like to photograph a muscle man. And so she'd find a muscle man. She'd call him up, or she'd research a carnival that might be coming to town. She'd haunt the sideshows and find herself a muscle man. So she was an interesting person who was ruled by passions that were deep and perhaps a little self-destructive. But that sent her off on her quest, and we have these photographs as a result. It's worth looking at, and I will go back to this. Critics, viewers, fans continue to debate Ms. Arbus's intentions when she chose her subjects. She called them freaks. And did she love them? Was it her desire or intention to dignify them, or just to get a kick out of being with them? And I say that as if it's one of those two. She was an extremely complicated person. Biographers have written books about her and this very question. But the point is that whether she's with this guy, whom she personally referred to as a freak, and in that era, I bet he did too, or she's with these guys, everybody for her becomes a freak. Normal people reveal to her camera kind of a bizarre and uncanny, a kind of off part of themselves. On the street, these two people would seem worlds apart, but in her lens and with that strobe technique, the prints she made, they are all of a piece. People are strange, they're uncanny. It's a David Lynchy vibe that she was seeking. And that's mostly a casting thing. Surely she's a great photographer, but she's a spectacular caster. She found the people that she needed. And that's the main thing she did. So I think we're getting close to the end. Let me spend a few more minutes. So this is, by the way, the New Jersey giant. He's got another name in her book. Anyway, this is the great giant with his parents in their home. And, you know, so this is the kind of, she would read about something like this in the paper and say, oh my God, I must photograph that guy. And you notice she doesn't photograph him like she photographs this guy. It's not the kind of confrontational picture which might seem heroic. She's after something uncanny, a strange juxtaposition. She's after discomfort. This photograph has that voyeuristic kind of icky, very David Lynchian vibe. And she knew just what she was doing. The final project she did in her life before her suicide in 1971 was this group in New Jersey of developmentally disabled people of all ages. They lived in a home or a facility, young and old alike. Here they are going to a Halloween party. And again, this is this disturbing David Lynchian quality. It's a very straight take on, it's a very straight take. And I think that's probably what's Lynchian about it. Okay, so as I say, I think we're coming in for a landing. It's an hour and 16 right now, so that must be something like 6:16 Pacific Standard Time. I'll spend a couple more minutes, and we'll talk about one more issue. It's an issue of technology and culture that changes street photography. So. For years and years and years, street photography had been done with black and white products only. I think I forgot to mention that arguably the golden age of street photography, so from the mid-60s kind of onward, that era where Cartier-Bresson was making some of his best work, and so was Robert Frank, Gary Winogrand, Diana Arbus, all those folks, and the many, many others we haven't talked about. That golden age was, in a way, driven by, at least spurned by, the very simple, invention of Tri-X film. Heretofore, black and white products had been at 125 ASA/ISO. For those of you who have never used film, but have only used digital cameras, ISO and ASA are arguably the same thing. So for years and years, 125 ASA was the best you could do. And depending on where you lived in the country and where you procured your materials, it might be 50 ASA that you were stuck with. Suddenly, there's Tri-X, a Kodak brand at 400 ASA, and it was pushable. It was designed to be pushable to 800 or even 1200. Gary Winogrand habitually pushed to 1200. And when we say pushed, we mean you don't increase the sensitivity that's dialed into the film, but you, in the process of developing the film with the film chemistry, you can change the appearance of the film so that it looks as if it's showing you more. It looks as if it's more sensitive. And so you can photograph under a wide variety of situations and lighting circumstances that you could never have done before. So that fact alone made much of the street photography that followed from 1954 onward possible. Isn't that crazy, right? It's just like our digital cameras now make so much possible that no matter what you had hoped or desired or dreamed about, you couldn't have done it until the advent of digital cameras. In the same way, color products became available and improved. Also, the print-making process of color products became new and improved in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so color infiltrates street photography in a big way. And you might wonder, well then, why do we begin with this black and white? Here is Helen Levitt, one of the rare, capital R, rare street photographers who was a woman, but as with everybody else, she was a New Yorker. So very few women, and everybody was a New Yorker. Levitt was born in Brooklyn in the 30s. She taught art classes in Harlem and began making photographs in Manhattan, of course, in black and white. That was the coin of the realm in those days. It was the only film that was available. And as you can see, this was, if you were a street photographer, and here's why street photographers are street photographers, because streets are outside and that's where the sun is, right? These street photographs, as with most that you have seen, are done outside because that's the only way it's possible to expose negatives. She made these street photographs, which are a national treasure in New York City, on the east side of Manhattan and in Harlem, between about 1940 and about 1960. And then she changed to color. She experimented with it for about 3 years and didn't go back, but she planted a flag and influenced a whole generation of color photographers thereafter. So she is an early pioneer in color use out there on the streets. As was Ernst Haas. Ernst Haas was an Austrian trained in Vienna, who came to the US in 1950. He had been invited to join one of the earliest iterations of the Magnum Agency, and he came to New York to live, and on the assumption that he might have to do color for commercial magazines at some point, he trained himself rigorously for the first 3 months he lived in New York. In other words, he shot the shit out of New York City as soon as he got off the boat, and then published those photographs in 2 consecutive issues of Life magazine, and again planted a flag, and he became one of the great pioneers of color photography in the years before 1970. Up until recently, his photo book, The Creation, Color Photographs in the American West, was one of the great bestsellers. And he did the Marlboro campaign, the original Marlboro Man and those dashing horses, all that cowboy stuff was a creation of Ernst Haas. So we will finish with Color's breakthrough, which is William Eggleston, of course. Eggleston, separate from all these other photographers we've discussed, Eggleston was not a high-strung New Yorker. Eggleston was a laconic Southern gentleman, another child of wealth who grew up in Memphis and on a plantation in northern Mississippi. He began making photographs in black and white in the mid-60s, and in the late 60s changed to color transparency materials, and thereafter changed back to color negative materials. Many of the great Eggleston shots that we're aware of from the mid-70s onward are actually color negative materials, but his first round of famous photographs was made with transparency materials between about 1967 and 72, 73, 74. Those are the pictures, a vast catalog of those pictures, from which John Sarkovsky, you'll remember our director at the Museum of Modern Art, Sarkovsky chose 74 of those because Sarkovsky himself desired to put color on the map, and he chose Eggleston as his guy. Eggleston was going to be his exemplar of what the new color street photography could look like. So here's a handful of Eggleston's photographs, mostly from Memphis and northern Mississippi. Later on, he would begin traveling, and for many years, he never stopped traveling. Many critics at the time hated the show. They believed that the pictures were boring and they were baffled. Clearly, the Museum of Modern Art was championing these pictures, and many people said, but why? How is it that so much time and attention has been lavished on these snapshots, these ambiguous snapshots? But over time, photographers embraced the influence, and Eggleston has become the essential kind of pioneering hero of a certain kind of artful street photography. So we'll stop here. Yeah, there's a lot more we could talk about, but I'm mindful of our time, and I want to open this up to questions and answers, or your questions. I'll see if I can answer. We'll open them up to your questions.
Hey, Thomas, it's Jason. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for being here. We do have about 10 minutes to go, but we don't have any questions in the chat. So we've got a small enough group. If you do have a question for Thomas, I think it's okay. If it's okay with you, Thomas, we'll just have them unmute themselves and go ahead and shout out their question and just let us know who we're hearing from. So if any of y'all have any questions for Thomas, please just go ahead and open your microphones up and go ahead and ask out.
Blanca, I'm counting on you.
I have a question. My name is Lori.
Hi, Lori.
So you ended at 2000, and
Yeah.
obviously I think the iPhone came out in 2006. What do you think about the trend now that everybody in the world is a street photographer? They all think they're influencers, and they're all using their phones to take pictures.
Well, on the first level, my first draft response is it's implied by kind of your chortling. You were chortling while you asked that question, because it's ridiculous to imagine that everybody can be a photographer who has influence and does street photography with a cell phone. Having said that, some people do have influence, and some people are doing great work. I think this is a brand new wrinkle in what we know about mass culture. I think people started to study mass culture 100 years ago, and especially after the Second World War, it became a real field of study because our culture became mass culture with TV, radio, magazines, on, and then cable and streaming, and then the internet with social media. Some people do and will do very good work. I know of a couple of them that I look at on Instagram all the time who are shooting with cell phones. And the rest of them, I actually don't, they don't offend me too much, except in museums. I always wonder what those people are doing, racing through the museum, basically recording every painting or object they come across. And I think, what will you do? Do you intend to kind of review those pictures back in the hotel later on? But clearly, this is how people, they interact. They find some connection by making the picture. I have to say, I mean, I make connections by making pictures too. What I mean is, I connect to a moment, I connect to a place, I connect to an object. When I'm walking in New York City and I look up and see the Empire State Building, I'm quite aware that there are 1 million maudlin and sentimental pictures of the Empire State Building have been made. And it's almost criminal for me to make yet another one. But I do, because when I press the button and there's the Empire State Building in my lens, there's something happens, something cool. And I find it's harmless, and I'm only barely ashamed of myself. I think it's a way we connect with certain objects and events in the world, is to make a picture of them. And it's looked at from a distance, it's silly, but it's harmless silly. And so as long as people don't make claims. I mean, I think that's partly what you're talking about, is people who claim that they are now an influencer, claim that they are a street photographer. Well, you know, that's just the age we're in. People claim shit all the time. Whatever. They've got to say something. Everybody's on the Twitter typing and typing and typing. They got to have something to say.
I've got a kind of related question. We're dealing with this ocean of street photographers. I mean, this is just street photography. Just it's like the excuse for everything. What do you say that history says that will help us evaluate what is of value out of this tornado of images that we're looking at today?
Well, Sandra, if the kind of the context of what you're saying is street photography, this torrent of street photographs, I tell you the truth. I am a great fan of street photography in its past. I'm still fascinated and passionate about new work that I see. But speaking generally, I kind of think street photography is almost moribund. Street photography was the conversation among practitioners, critics, academics, curators, and gallerists for 30 years, let's say 1960 to 1990. That's actually 40 years, isn't it? 60s, 70s, 80s, whatever. Anyway, for that period of time, there was always some new angle on street photography that we were interested in learning about. Some new street photographer who was doing something we hadn't seen before, pushing the boundaries. The craft was always evolving until, as with everything else, as with rock and roll, it peters out. And it peters out kind of in the mid-90s for a variety of reasons. So I think, like rock and roll, it's a little moribund now, but that might be great because maybe now it gets to regroup. New people come into the fold, they rethink it. I mean, we do see people doing street photography with large format cameras. Maybe people doing street photography with iPhones are just what it'll take. Somehow a hero will emerge. And I don't think that's directly to your point, but I think what I'm saying is, I don't think we know what the standards are anymore. I don't think we know why one type of street photography is better than the other, or one set of street photographs is better than another. I have my favorites, and when I see something that really moves me, I guess I know it. That's like that old Supreme Court thing, right? With the pornography, is that we'll know it when we see it. But I think we're waiting for a new set of standards. We're waiting for a new kind of wave of enthusiasm and people discussing it, and people trying to, passionate and smart people trying to see where this is going.
Yeah,
this is another way of saying I actually don't think it matters what we think about street photography now. I'm not sure it's got anything new to offer. It's a thing we can do. I mean, you know, it's just like we shoot hoops and we do whatever we do with our families. That's all good. But I'm not sure it matters right now. And I'm waiting for somebody, and it could be a curator, it could be John Sarkovsky, but it could be, the iPhone crowd, to figure out how to make it matter again, and then give us something to talk about.
I asked this because I just had a conversation recently with a whole group of street photographers, and they were talking about how much meaning that their work had. And when I asked them if the conclusions they had made about the people they photographed, if they had actually spoken with these people about this, and the answer was no. It's just sort of, in a lot of cases, drive-by target practice.
Yeah.
And yet they are calling this gallery-worthy material. And so that's why I'm asking for some way to sort all this mass of material.
Well, and I will without going on and on, and as you may have noticed, I'm quite prepared to just go on and on, to beat the horse till it's dead. But I was actually talking to my class last night about kind of these issues. I didn't have a chance to say it in this presentation, but I think there, in the 50s, photographers kind of split. And this is a very general comment. They split between old school humanist values in the choice of subject matter and the way they handled subject matter. So that would have been Vivian Meyer, who was anonymous at the time, of course, but also Helen Levitt, Cartier-Bresson to some extent. The entire Magnum Agency basically were humanists who believed that that values and ideals were universal. They were out there and they are waiting for us to find them and photograph them. Basically, we need to just be respectful and efficient and get the picture, because those values and ideals they are strong and obvious, and they drive our moral lives, right? Today, I mean, you can look at the photographs today on the Instagram, even on the, I guess, CNN maybe, the photographs of David Turnley. Either of the Turnley brothers are out there on a train in between Poland and Ukraine, making photographs which espouse those kind of humanist ideals, which are human dignity is beautiful, and we are beautiful in our pain and our perseverance, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm all for that. But as a kind of a trend in the way we think about pictures, I always found that to be an old-fashioned trend. People like Robert Frank and then Gary Winogrand, Lee Friedlander, those others, they kind of proposed a different notion about what you do with the material of the world. When you go out onto the street, David Turnley or Helen Levitt are looking for examples of fathers and sons throwing a baseball, two lovers smooching, an old man reading La Figaro, right? They're looking for exemplary images that demonstrate life is beautiful and we are all here together, right? Whereas Friedlander says, I don't care about that. I'm a photographer after all. I work with lines and light, color and shape, with allusion and reference. I'm making visual puns. I'm interested in a father and son throwing a baseball only to the extent that I might see something interesting or visually sardonic, or it might solve a puzzle that's graphic. Those people want to go out to the world, and I would fall in their camp personally. And I think many street photographers of current vintage also fall in their camp. We want to go out to the world and use what's in the world to create our own, to create our work graphically and otherwise. The father and son playing baseball, for me, the baseball is a round thing that is useful to me. The bat is a line that is useful to me. And that bright red cap is a color and a shape that's useful to me. That's a long, blithering response that says, maybe those people you were talking to are onto something, in the sense that they don't believe they need to talk to their subjects. I surely don't. Robert Frank never did. Lee Friedlander, Gary Winogrand never did. The point is that the material of the world is useful to us as photographers, and the human dimension, the beautiful humanity of those people, well, I can engage them in conversation when we're on the street together, when we're waiting at the bus stop together. I'm all about their beautiful humanity, but as a photographic artifact, my picture doesn't include that stuff. My picture includes lines, lights, cultural references, pop references. That's what's in the picture. And I think those photographers made that decision as a generation. They made that decision, and they got my attention. So I think that the stuff that's in the world is useful to a certain kind of photographer who is making what they believe to be photographic photographs rather than literary or poetic photographs that evince values. Does that make any sense?
I think so. Sandra, thanks so much for your question, and Thomas, thanks for your response. We are at 6:35 Pacific Standard Time. We did have one question come through the chat, and
holy shit.
I think we can address that, and then we'll wrap things up. And let's try and keep it to about 5 minutes. But Suze Lippmans asks, do you think street photography and social documentary are interchangeable, or is there a spectrum? And in parentheses, she also said that she wanted to hear your favorite photographers too. So if we can get that tidied up in about 5 minutes, I think then we'll wrap things up for the night. But yeah, that's the last question that we see in the chat there.
Well, John Sarkovsky, sorry, I must have gone down the wrong pipe. John Sarkovsky definitely thought they were interchangeable. And I hadn't really noticed that before until last week when I was rereading some of his stuff in preparation for this. For him, social documentary and street photography are all the same thing because these are the same photographers doing it. And now, bear in mind, when he uses those words, he's referring to the 1965 notion of social documentary. I think in the 2000s, we have become, we just put things into categories more often. And I think that's because the channels by which we communicate, the formats and the venues through which we communicate. So, you know, whether it's email or Twitter or, you know, social media, those channels require kind of movable versions of things. So, for example, to say, well, I'm just a photographer doesn't say enough. We want to be able to say, I'm a street photographer. And now that information can travel. It can travel through Twitter. It could travel through Facebook. And I'm an influencer. We need to brand ourselves and call ourselves and what they used to say, pigeonhole ourselves in order to communicate on these vast chains of communication. And so, you know, people call themselves social documentarians because they're advised to call themselves something. And I think social documentary has become kind of what if your client is a nonprofit, you're doing social documentary work. If you're working for a newspaper that can afford it, you can spend 6 months being with COVID patients on a certain ward, or you can photograph Syrian refugees who have come here to have, you know, a leg removed, you know, whatever, right? Those are the stories we do where they're long form stories and they are considered to be social documentary stories. And that's become kind of a hardened genre. And I think part of that is it's from newspapers. Newspapers have become the vehicle for that kind of work. And somewhat maybe the internet through people's websites or through other organizations that publish because they can, right? On the internet, you can publish 40 pictures. You can't really do that in the Sunday edition of even a big paper, but on the internet you can. But I think it's through clients have chosen to call things social documentary. And so it's become kind of hardened. But back in the day, Sarkovsky all he meant was people who were making straight photographs of shit that was in the world and they were informed by, they had a certain point of view about what popular culture was. They had a certain point of view about the politics or philosophies of the day. So they were socially aware in literally in that sense of being aware of how society works, how culture works, and how what they're seeing and photographing fits into that whole matrix, right? So that was a social documentary photographer in 1965. In 2015, a social documentary photographer is somebody who's doing a certain and particular thing, advocacy, working with a certain group of people for a certain client that advocates, probably the client advocates. So anyways, what Sarkovsky meant about that and what we mean about that, two different things. In that regard, social documentary and street photography are different, but only because the categories are hardening, because, you know, social media demands that we harden the categories. Otherwise, what are we going to talk about?
All right, fantastic. Thanks so much, Thomas. I think that brings us to the conclusion. Brandon, you want to take us out?
Yeah, sure. Just want to thank Tom for a wonderful evening here. All the work that he put in preparing this lecture. There's a lot of time on the back end with all the slides and everything. So very, very appreciative of the work that's put in for these things. It does take a lot of time, I know.
You can only guess.
So thank you, Tom. We're getting a lot of great comments here in the chat too about how they really appreciated the evening and the talk. So kudos to you.